so you can play.
Matthew here from MiniWarGaming.com, and it's time for another video in our series of Matthew reviews his initial thoughts, and then the talks about 40k 7th edition. And don't forget, you can win one of these big babies by, and this is the limited edition 40k rule book box set thingy. The rule book itself is not limited edition, but this thing is. You can win it. There's two of them to be won. One of them just by being a Vault member. I'm going to choose a random Vault member sometime in June, and they will get this. And the other way, you can look at the description, the video description below will give you instructions on how to do it. If you're a Vault member, you can do both, of course, but you can only win one of them. Today, I am going to talk about, ooh, that almost fell. I am going to talk about the Assault phase. We've already covered Psychic phase and the Shooting phase. Now we're going to talk about the changes in the Assault phase. Like the Shooting phase, the Assault phase remains mostly unchanged, but there's been some subtle changes that I think are going to have some serious impact on the way the game works. So let's jump right into it. The first thing is charging through difficult terrain. Very, very subtle change. Before, if you were charging through difficult terrain, and sometimes it got confusing whether you were charging through difficult terrain or not, because it's like, well, if he's like 10 inches away, and I guess if I roll an 11 or 12 inch charge, and this one guy over here might go through difficult terrain, so I guess I gotta roll difficult terrain, which basically means that it's impossible, but then I roll like exactly 10, and then that means I wouldn't have gone through difficult terrain, and so I don't have to go to, I don't know, it was confusing. Now, it's simpler. You roll, and you lose, or you be basically at -2 to your charge range if somebody has to go through difficult terrain. Now there's still the same question of does something have to go through difficult terrain will come up. But the nice thing is it can come up after you roll rather than before. So you're like, okay, well, let's just roll it. Like I'm 6 inches away, but if I have to go after these guys that are over here, let's say I roll a 9-inch charge and there's difficult terrain up here. So let's say that charging unit charged the chargee, and let's say there's some difficult terrain up here. And let's say this is 6 inches away, but if you roll a 9-inch charge, then like some of the guys will get here, and then you're supposed to go into base contact, so you're supposed to wrap around, and then you end up going through some of that difficult terrain. Well, the nice thing is since it's just a -2, rather than throwing another die and finding out what the charge range is, you can roll, and then you can start to move your guys, and if you see that one of them has to go through difficult terrain, then you subtract 2 from the overall charge distance. And if that was in question, it most likely won't stop the charge from happening. Like in that case, the terrain is further away, so it's just going to be -2, so all of a sudden the other guy's trying to move really far, they just get -2 their charge range. I think it'll rarely happen that you'll roll, you'll start moving and realize that you actually can't make the charge because it's just out. And if that's the case, then it was most likely obvious that you were going through difficult terrain, so you could have done the -2. So it kind of removes that huge change to how far you are charging just by making it -2. Whereas before, when you rolled a third die and then discarded the highest, like if you rolled a 6 and a 1, that's a 7-inch charge range. But if you throw a third die in there, you're discarding that 6. So it's gonna get smaller. You roll a 2 and it's all of a sudden it's like -4 inches to your charge range. So maybe statistically -2 is about the same. Somebody out there can tell me, they can do the math and be like, actually -2 is exactly the same as doing it if you're looking at pure statistics. But I like it better because it's a solid number that I can visualize and I can figure out. Still, you get initiative 1 if you charge for difficult terrain, unless you have assault grenades or stuff like that, but that hasn't changed at all. Multiple charges has been made a lot more clear. Before it was, I'm charging you, and so then you start moving in your guys, and then if you were able to, you can be like, okay, now I'm going to make a secondary target and charge over there, and all of a sudden they got an overwatch, which might have stopped the guys from charging in the first place. Now you have to declare it all right away. You say, I'm going to charge, that's my primary target, which has to be somebody you shot at, or you had to not shoot at all, and then these are my secondary targets. Might just be one. And the reason there's a difference between primary and secondary is because you first have to charge the primary. And then if you have a guy who can't get into base contact with somebody from the primary, he can go into base contact with somebody from the secondary as long as he remains in coherency. So that didn't really change how you do the charge. It's just now you have to declare it beforehand, so all the overwatch gets resolved, which is nice because then you don't have any confusion over whether the models would have made it or not, or which ones were closest at the time of the overwatch. So once again, any rules that get clarified, that's just a good thing. And you might think, well, an FAQ could have done that. An FAQ could have changed a lot of things, that's for sure. But then you've got 2 books to read. You've got the rule book, and then you've got the FAQ, which is not very helpful. So what else have we got? Oh, 2 other things. Flying monsters, creatures, and challenges. Flying monsters, creatures first. They got a bit of a nerf. And a buff, and a nerf, and a buff. But the nerf is in the assault phase. Basically, you got a swooping monstrous creature. Swooping is up in the air. Remember, you have 2 choices. He can be swooping, or he can be gliding. And swooping, it's the same thing. But anyways, the swooping monstrous creature, flying monstrous creature is up in the air, and he's like a flyer. He's going around, and he can skyfire, and and he can't, if you shoot at him, it's snap firing and all that kind of, unless you have Skyfire. But before, what you could do is you could start the game in gliding mode. So you start them on the table. Turn 1, you go, I'm going to swooping mode. Boom, you go across the table, which was usually suicide for Hive Tyrants, as I found out. But it's good for other things like Demon Princes or things that have really good psychic, like Biomancy, where they get the +3 of their toughness, and they're like, you can't hurt me. I'm toughness 9 or 8 or whatever. Especially with Biomancy now giving the Iron Arm +3 no matter what, which just makes things pretty much invincible who are using Iron Arm on their Demon Princes or whatever. Anyways, they'd fly over, and then in turn 2 they'd be like, I'm gliding, and then they charge into combat and just tear you a new one, and you just rip through your guys. Now you can't do that. If you switch to gliding from swooping, you are not allowed to charge that turn. That is a big change. It means you leave yourself vulnerable for an entire turn. So it stops people from doing that, just swooping across, gliding, and whatever. It kind of forces you to use your Flying Monstrous creature kind of as one or the other. Is he going to be a jump monstrous creature, or is he going to be a flyer? Now the nice thing is if you get grounded during your opponent's turn, then you can actually charge. Even though you went from swooping to gliding, you did not make the change in your movement phase, so you're actually allowed to do it. And speaking of grounded tests, they've gotten a little better, because now at the end of the phase, if you took 1 unsaved wound, then you take a grounded test. Now that does mean in the movement phase you could go down to Vector Strikes or things like Imatech the Stormlord's lightning attacks, or something that happens automatically. But what it also means is stupid Tau Marker Lights can't down you anymore. Little laser pointers going in the eyes of the Hive Tyrant going, oh, I can't see! And then he falls down and crashes and takes a strength 9, no saves allowed, and he dies because then everybody else fires at him. And since it's at the end of the shooting phase, everybody has to snap fire before he comes down. So it's not like one person's like, I'm gonna take some bolter shots at him. And he comes down and then everybody else fires. I never really had an issue with that, but I don't complain when the Flying Monstrous creatures get a little better, because they did take a bit of a nerf. Vector Strike changed, it's not as good, and Smash attacks unfortunately took a big hit. But that's going to be for a later video when we talk about special rules. So the Flying Monstrous creature in regards to the assaulting has been nerfed, but at the same time received some other buffs, so maybe it's okay. Lastly, challenges have changed slightly in that I'm not hating them as much anymore. And here's what would happen. Hive Tyrant flies into a group of Space Marine Tactical Marines. The guys are, I've got my 5 attacks. And that's, I know he sounded like an orc there, but it doesn't really matter. And then the Space Marine Sergeant goes, I challenge you with my chainsword. And the Hive Tyrant's like, oh, seriously? Fine, I have to accept because I'm by myself. And then he goes up to the Sergeant, and guess what happens to the Sergeant? The Sergeant goes, actually doesn't even get a chance because he's a lower initiative. And the Hive Tyrant goes, tick, 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 and hits him with like 4 out of 5 of the attacks and completely decapitates him, overkilling him by like 2 or 3 wounds. You're talking about Space Marines here. Killing a couple extra Space Marines is a big deal, especially if you're like charging in with gaunts to help out or whatever. Now that doesn't happen. Wounds now spill over. If you kill the other character in a challenge and you would have caused more wounds, then those wounds spill over to the rest of the group. And it happens in the reverse way as well. That if they kill everybody and they have some extra wounds, it goes into the challenge. Now all the details of how that works, you're going to have to read the rule book, because there's questions about toughnesses and saves and everything else like that. That's fine. The fact that one can affect the other is awesome, because that was the thing I hated most. If you look at the Snagabog's Greed Orc and Blood Angel campaign, I don't know how many times I'd charge in with a bunch of boys with the Knob with Power Claw, and then Dave with his Sergeant with Power Fist would be like, I challenge you, and they would kill each other, but my Knob would kill him 3 times, and he'd kill me only once, which means I would have killed 2 more Space Marines in that fight. And guess what? With the orcs, that's what you need to do. The Power Claw needs to do all the work, and the rest of the guys are just there for support. But because he challenged me, I was only able to do 1 wound, and then it just makes such a big difference, because after it's the turn that they charge that they got all their oomph. So in pretty much every way that I've hated challenges, like a Turvagon charging into a bike squad with the Sergeant then says, I challenge you, he dies, but then they hit and run away because they're Dark Angels. I hated that. Or the Orc Knob going in and killing the Sergeant 3 times. I hated that. Or the Hive Tyrant going in and only be able to kill the Sergeant. I hated that. Now all those things are gone. Now you can challenge me all you want. I'll kill your guy and kill a few more of them as well. Because that was mainly the place where challenges were really being used in what I could see, was people just trying to reduce the effectiveness of your awesome character, rather than, and Turvicons I know aren't characters anymore, that I'm talking about old stuff, rather than just being able to fight them in some other way, just throwing out the meat shield out with one little guy, and it just didn't feel right. I just was kind of frustrated by that, and now I'm not. Now it's awesome. Thank you, Games Workshop, for making that change. So those are the changes for the assault phase. I'm sure there's a few other little ones that I missed, but those are the major ones that I could see. So go ahead, leave your comments below. What did I miss for the assault phase? And do you think I got anything wrong? Read the book first and then post a comment on what you think I got wrong. Of course, don't forget to win one of these. And I already talked about how. The details are in the video description below. This is Matthew from MiniWarGaming. Thanks for watching. Stay tuned for more of me reviewing 7th edition 40K. Happy wargaming.
We work so you can play.